All right, so here in section 3, we're going to now look at the end of the civil rights movement and kind of what followed that, which was really the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement kind of developed alongside the civil rights movement, kind of at the same time. But the key thing to remember here is that there's actually two groups that are kind of, well, multiple groups that are fighting for different things at the same time. They're not both looking for this non-peaceful, integrate society, everybody equal. That is not what everybody was looking for out of these movements in the 60s, and even into the 70s. And the Black Power movement really um, takes over following the civil rights legislation that we talked about at the end of last section, where you actually have civil rights legislation that legally in the United States enforces integration, enforces equality from a legal standpoint based on race. Black Power movement, because that was not its real goal. It does not come to an end and continues to push forward. Um, and really, you could say that some of the social justice, some of that stuff is still kind of remnants of some of the Black Power movements that take place. So we're going to look at just a couple of quick aspects of this, um, and then we'll wrap up in this section with the civil rights movement. So probably by far the most recognizable member of the Black Power movement was this man, Malcolm Little. But more commonly known as Malcolm X. Um, Malcolm Little grew up in Michigan, and in Lansing, Michigan, and as a child, he saw the brutal realities of racism and the KKK and some of these awful aspects in the United States. And as we said, the KKK, the segregationism, the racism was not limited to the South. Obviously, in Lansing, Michigan, uh, Malcolm X, as he becomes experienced that. His house was burned down by the KKK. Eventually, his father was murdered. He blames this on white supremacy. He blames it on the white people in um, in Michigan, and kind of this idea that um, white people are white people are always going to try, white people are always going to try and subjugate and keep black people down. And so he ends up moving um, and um, to Brooklyn, and he finds himself kind of wrapped up in all kinds of illegal activities, and eventually finds himself in prison. It's while he's in prison that he makes a decision that's going to kind of alter the course of his life. Um, Under the guidance of some of the other inmates, while he's in prison, he's looking for something to change the direction of his life, and so he is converted to Islam um, in prison. And so it's not simply just Islam, but the Nation of Islam, which was kind of a branch of Islam, a kind of sect of Islam that focused on black nationalism, black identity, uh, and black power. Um, it's from that point on that Malcolm X takes on this very separatist and nationalistic view of African Americans in the United States. This idea that um, the Nation of Islam did not promote integration. They weren't looking for equal rights. What they were looking for was segregation, but with black people as the power of that. Whereas before it was white power was in charge of the segregation. This was an aspect of we want to segregate ourselves. We want to have our own communities. We want to have our own schools, but we're going to do it under our direction, the way we want to do it, and then we're going to raise our kids to be better, right? And we're basically going to shove it down their faces and show them what black people can do. And this was a very different approach than Martin Luther King Jr. And some of the other civil rights activists in the South, whereas they were, like I said, trying to go for integration, equal rights, bring everybody together. I have a dream, right? Malcolm X is not on board with that. The Nation of Islam is not on board with that at all. The Nation of Islam had actually been founded by a man named Wallace Fard in the 1930s. And again, they actually had its roots kind of in Marcus Garveyism, or in Garveyism, led by a man named Marcus Garvey, who, if y'all remember, we talked about him at one point, where it was like the Back to Africa movement, where he was trying to get everybody, and he had the steam liners, and he was going to get everybody and put them on cruise ships and go back to Africa and set up their own nation. And a lot of the ideas of the Nation of Islam involved some of that too. They wanted their own state in the United States where it was just black led. Only black people could live there. That, let me show you how great our state can be if you'll get out of our way. Now, interestingly enough, Wallace Fard kind of disappears in the mid 1930s. He kind of literally just kind of disappears, and he ends up being replaced by another man named Elijah Muhammad. And Elijah Muhammad becomes the leader of the Nation of Islam and takes it in a much more violent direction, I guess. Instead of peaceful resistance, it's violent resistance by any means necessary, kind of a Machiavellian look at getting what they wanted. If you won't give it to us, we'll take it from you. And so this becomes kind of the direction that Malcolm X goes. Now, Malcolm X is a very well-spoken, very charismatic, very strong leader. And very quickly, Elijah Muhammad ends up putting Malcolm X in charge of the Nation of Islam as basically their keynote speaker. And it was at that time when he converted. Obviously, he ditches the name Little and goes with this variable X because he saw Little as a last name that was given to him by white people, and that it was not truly his last name, that his last name was something when they came over from Africa, and that white people changed it. And so he's going to go with X. And so now you have Malcolm X. Now, under the leadership of Malcolm X, you have the growth of what becomes known as Black Muslims, which you have the tenets of the Prophet Muhammad, you have the tenets of the Quran, but woven into there is, like I said, these Black nationalism, Black ideological ideas that are going to be really the anchor point of the Black Power movement. He's going to go around and give speeches and preach that Black people are genetically superior to white people, which he often referred to as the white devil. This idea that you've been lied to. They've been telling you that Black people are less, or that Black people are inferior. In fact, we are more advanced. Our civilizations dated back longer than white people's civilizations did, and thus we've actually developed better, and that we're going to take control of our country. Now, there comes a point where he starts to kind of get the feeling, he is a true believer in Islam, and he starts to get the feeling that Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, has kind of started to use this ideology not for the betterment of Black people, but for the betterment of Elijah Muhammad. And Malcolm X kind of looks at this, and he kind of has a falling out with the Nation of Islam. He ends up actually leaving the Nation of Islam over some of their doctrine that is in place. Now, Malcolm X was kind of essential in converting Cassius Clay to the Nation of Islam. Cassius Clay famously then becomes the boxer Muhammad Ali. And so, Muhammad Ali kind of follows the same pathway into the Nation of Islam. And so Malcolm X becomes kind of this celebrity talker, much like MLK Jr. becomes in the peaceful protest, civil rights movement. But he ends up leaving the Nation of Islam, and he kind of goes through this crisis, not a crisis of faith, but a reevaluation of, what he truly believes. He makes a pilgrimage to Mecca, and he comes back from that pilgrimage with much softer ideas about Islam, much softer ideas about Black power, and particularly the violence involved with Black power. And so he starts to kind of soften his rhetoric a little bit. Now, he goes as far to go and actually he meets face to face with MLK. And I believe that was around the time of the Selma March. He goes and meets with MLK, which was kind of unthinkable because they were so far off on their ideology of how to get about getting these rights for black people. And so they were kind of enemies. Then he kind of sits down and talks with him, comes out of that. 2 weeks later, Malcolm X is assassinated by the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam actually kills him because he was such a good speaker. He was such a good leader. The fact that he was now kind of branching away from what they were doing and kind of still using the words and themes of Islam and still using black, you know, power and stuff, but not in the way they wanted him to. They saw him now as a threat to their movement, and they actually have him killed, which is kind of wild. Another main key organization that is formed in the Black Power movement is the formation of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, in 1966. This is done by two men named Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. Once again, this is based heavily on the ideas of Marcus Garvey and the Black Back to Africa movement. This idea that we are not for integration, we are for segregation. That black people are powerful, black people are wonderful. There's nothing to be ashamed of. They kind of bring back this idea of reclaiming black culture from Africa. And instead of conforming and melding into white culture in the United States, that they were going to have a reemergence of black culture. One of the key telltale signs of the Black Panther movement was the reemergence, the widespread reemergence of like afros. Like, believe it or not, the afro was very much looked down upon in terms of culturally in America, right? Because that black people's afro is a little bit, their hair is different in a lot of ways, and so when you look at Caucasian people hair and black people hair, and the idea that you just let it go and just let it stand out and all of this, that was kind of looked down upon culturally. Black Panthers say, you know what, heck with that. We're gonna just, this is me, this is my hair, this is black culture, this is what we're gonna do, and they kind of go through that. I still can't look at the Black Panther and not think of Forrest Gump, but because of that scene, he's like, "Sorry, I ruined your Black Panther party," which is really a funny moment in that movie. But it was a very, very powerful movement, and we know that you had the race riots and stuff like that in California. The Black Panthers had a lot to do with that. Not with like, I mean, the ideology of that spurred on a lot of discontent that led to that. Not that the Black Panthers were directly responsible, which I don't know enough to know if they really were and weren't. They could have been, but I'm not going to cast those aspersions. I'm just saying that that ideology is what led to a lot of the discontent in places like Detroit and Brooklyn and Oakland and Los Angeles and some of these major places that have race riots, that the ghetto uprisings, as it said in the last section, that these came from this idea of black power and black nationalism. Again, some of these things are left over. Like today, Black Studies becomes a major part, and Black Studies was not a thing. Black Studies was not a thing at universities. Now, almost every single university in the country has a Black Studies department. There are not Black historians, but like historians of Black culture. That it is a major division of history, and the idea that we are going to take something that has been ignored and really build on it and really understand it and see how it fits into American culture, because it's undeniable that black culture and American culture are the same. I mean, there is our culture in America. You could not trace it back to one group or another. It really is a meld of all. And during the Black Power movement, this is where the word Negro actually goes out of style to some extent. Negro before that was not a racist term. It was more of a classification term, where now we say African American, we say black, depending on who's going to punch you in the face for what you decide to say, which is ridiculous because it seems in America today, it's hard to be right no matter what you say. But you can't say that most of the time. But like I said, that was not necessarily a racist term. That was simply a term that was like based on skin color. I mean, it was, but it turns into the Black Power movement turns that into something. Hey, we're not going to use those terms anymore, and they kind of have fallen out. And then you get the 1968 Olympics, which I think is a really important um, moment in history because it just kind of shows. I mean, 1968, you see that what is still happening in the United States is no longer the civil rights movement, quote unquote, that MLK was taking part in. This idea that was we want to integrate, we want equal legal rights, we want to be protected under the law, we want to be treated fairly, we want all these things to society to be working in harmony. That kind of comes to an end with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. Those things made all legal hurdles to equality from a federal level mute, right? They basically said that Jim Crow laws are now illegal. These states are going to have to rewrite their state laws. You can't discriminate based on race. And so now you get this 1968 and you still have what is left over, which is the Black Power movement. And that's how you know that these are two separate movements. And so you may have at some point in your life seen this photograph. Has anybody not seen this photograph before? It's a very, very famous photograph. This photograph comes from the 1968 Olympics. These two men here are from the United States of America. The International Olympic Committee, the IOC, had come out and said, hey, we are not going to have any civil, demonstrations. The Olympics are meant to be where we all come together. We're all treated equally. We're all competitors. We all have the same, lodging, food. We have all the same thing. This is not a place for political statements. Okay. And we're not going to tolerate that. That's not in conjunction with what the Olympics stand for. We stand for these things. So we don't want this. So it comes down to the 200-meter dash. And you have here Tommy Smith, who is at the top of the podium. He finishes first. I believe he set a new world record at that time. He wins first. And then you have the other man here in third is John Carlos. And he finishes third. He runs like 20.1 seconds or something. It was like one of the fastest 200 races ever run by that time. And they get up and they, at the Olympics, they play the national anthem. They do all these things of all the countries. So they get up there and they stand there and they're ready they get their medals and they start to play the national anthem. And John Carlos and Tommy Smith pull out black gloves, put on their hands, give the Black Power symbol, and bow their heads. This was very divisive, right? For a country that, and for a people in particular, to be kind of called out on a global scale by this action after they had already passed the legal legislation to make it equal, it was kind of a shock to some people. Very infuriating. Hey, we gave you what you wanted, but what they didn't realize is that not everybody wanted the same things. And that's where you kind of see this demarcation of there's two separate movements happening. Just because one ended doesn't mean everybody is going to be happy with it. Obviously, some of the civil rights movement's goals that were reached, you get into an economic recession in the 70s, and this is going to squeeze some of those aspects. It's going to not be as successful immediately just because of economic purposes. In the northern phase is not as successful either, where people kind of got to sit back and say, well, we've never really had Jim Crow laws. There was a really interesting book that I read when I was in my grad school class that had a discussion from a woman in the North who said during this time she would much rather have lived in the South because at least in the South, you knew white people hated you, right? It was out front. It was in your face. I knew where I stood with you. That was it. She said in the North, it was like living with wolves in sheep's clothing, because the racism was still there. It may not have been legal, but you in the South, they'd say, I'm not going to give you this promotion because you're black. In the North, they'd say, we're not going to give you this promotion because you weren't qualified enough. But really, it was because you were black. And so it was this false sense of I can get better, even though the same ideology was in both areas. We're not going to let you get better. We're not going to let you live in that neighborhood. Oh, well, your financing didn't come through. Why not? Well, it just the finances aren't right now. They wouldn't say, oh, because you're black. In the South, they'd say it's because you're black. So at least you knew where you stood. Neither of those is good. I'm just saying that this was a quote from a woman, a black woman at the time, who said, I would much rather lived in the Jim Crow, not like lived in the South, because you knew where you stood with society. And so obviously that's not going to be super successful in the North. It's going to take a long time. We are still fighting some of these battles. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I think America is not the greatest country for multinationalism and multi-races in the world. There is nowhere better. I would challenge anybody to tell me, where is a place that equality is taken to the extent that it is in the United States, and the attention is put on equality for races and stuff like that. But it's not perfect. We're humans. It's never going to be perfect. But white unions are obviously going to resist this, because now that everything's equal, they're going to have to let black people into their union membership. Again, especially in the North, that's not going to go over very well. And people are going to resist that pretty heavily. Vietnam is then going to roll in. This war in Vietnam, this conflict in Vietnam, is going to kind of replace the civil rights as the new liberal crusade that goes into the late 60s and 70s. And then obviously Martin Luther King is assassinated as well. And actually, I believe it was like 2 weeks prior to the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, being passed, is when MLK was assassinated. Now, interestingly enough, just as a side note, MLK, towards the end of his life, was kind of becoming disillusioned with the peaceful protest movement. That whereas Malcolm X started out on the far extreme of violence and taking it through power, and he kind of softens down to more peaceful, MLK was actually getting to the point where he did not know if the peaceful protest was actually ever going to be successful. He did not have any faith in LBJ, who had taken over after Kennedy was assassinated. He didn't have faith that LBJ was actually going to do anything about this. And there's quite a bit of evidence that he had kind of just, not that he was losing faith, but that he was growing tired of not seeing the results. So Malcolm X gets assassinated when he softens his position. When MLK starts to harden his position, he gets assassinated too. Which there have been arguments made that if MLK had kind of done a 180 and changed his rhetoric and gone the other way, he may not have been this beloved civil rights leader that we all remember, and that his assassination may have been a result of trying to preserve that and making him a martyr for the cause, because shortly after that, they passed the civil rights legislation. And so there's a lot that goes into that. Lots of historical debate is taking place on the civil rights movement. I took a whole class on it. Super interesting, actually, all the different aspects of it. But that brings us to an end of this module.